Everyone remembers Ragnar Lothbrok. They remember Ivar the Boneless. They remember Bjorn Ironside. But there was another son of Ragnar whose story is far less famous. A warrior who marched with the Great Heathen Army, who helped bring England to the edge of collapse, and whose final battle would become one of the most dramatic Viking defeats in English history. His name was Ubbe Ragnarsson. According to the Norse sagas, he was one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons. But the deeper we look into his story, the harder it becomes to separate history from legend, because Ragnar himself stands somewhere between the two. The sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and while they give us a powerful story of Ragnar's sons, the contemporary English records are far less interested in family legends. They simply record the arrival of something terrifying, a massive Viking army, an army that didn't come to England for a single raid. It came to conquer, and somewhere among its commanders was a man later remembered as Ubbe. In 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. For generations, the English had learned to fear Viking ships. The pattern was always the same. The ships appeared on the horizon. Warriors came ashore. Monasteries were attacked. Silver was stolen. People were captured. And then the Vikings sailed away. But this time was different. The Vikings brought horses. They established winter camps. They captured towns. And instead of returning home after a raid, they stayed. They were turning from raiders into conquerors. The army first established itself in East Anglia. The local population supplied the Vikings with horses, and soon the army moved north. Their target was York. York was one of the most important cities in England, and the Northumbrians were already divided by a struggle between two rival kings. When the Vikings arrived, those divisions became disastrous. The two kings eventually joined forces against the invaders. They attacked York. For a moment, it looked as though the English might actually win. But the battle turned against them. Both Northumbrian kings were killed, and York fell into Viking hands. The Great Heathen Army now had one of the most important cities in England, but they wanted more. They moved through the kingdoms of England and San, and one by one, those kingdoms began to weaken. In East Anglia, King Edmund was defeated and killed. Later, medieval traditions would surround his death with a dramatic story of torture and martyrdom. And later, Norse tradition would connect Ragnar's sons with his fate. But the exact historical details remain uncertain. What we do know is that East Anglia fell under Viking control. Another kingdom had been broken, and the Vikings continued south. Mercia was next. The Mercians called upon Wessex for help. Among the Wessex forces was a young prince named Alfred. He would one day become Alfred the Great. But at this point, Alfred was not yet the king who would save Wessex. He was simply another warrior fighting an enemy that seemed almost impossible to stop. The Vikings continued their campaigns, and the enormous army that had arrived in England began to divide. Some forces moved north, others continued south. Some Vikings began settling permanently on conquered land, and one Viking commander would eventually lead a force into Devon. Later sources identify that commander as Ubbe. By this point, Ubbe had become part of a war that was no longer simply about raids. It was a fight for control of England. And in 878 AD, the situation became even more dangerous. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Wessex. Alfred was forced to flee. For a moment, it looked as though Wessex was finished. But while Alfred disappeared into the marshes of Athelney, another Viking force was moving west. Ubbe had sailed toward Devon. According to later accounts, he arrived with a large fleet. His army landed, and the English forces withdrew into a fortified position. The Vikings surrounded them. From Ubbe's perspective, the situation looked perfect. The English were trapped, They had nowhere to go. Their supplies would eventually run out. All the Vikings had to do was wait. But the English commander understood something. If they stayed inside, they would eventually starve. If they surrendered, they could lose everything. So they made a desperate decision. They would attack. Not tomorrow, not when the Vikings were ready. Now. The gates opened, the English army charged out, and suddenly, the Viking force that had come expecting an easy victory was fighting for its life. The battle had begun, and somewhere in the chaos stood Ubbe Ragnarsson, a son of one of the most famous Viking names in history, a commander who had spent years watching English kingdoms fall. But this time, the Vikings were surrounded by enemies who had nothing left to lose, and the man who had come to conquer Devon was about to fight his final battle. The English attack caught the Vikings off guard. The two armies crashed together, shields slammed into shields, spears pushed through gaps in the formations, axes struck wood and steel. The battlefield became chaos. The Vikings had the experience, they had the reputation. But the English had something just as powerful, desperation. They were fighting for survival, and slowly the Viking formation began to collapse. The army that had conquered kingdoms was now being pushed back. And then Ubbe was killed. The commander, associated with one of the most powerful Viking armies in England, had fallen on a battlefield in Devon. The Vikings suffered a devastating defeat. Later tradition adds another extraordinary detail to the story. A famous Viking symbol was supposedly captured during the battle, the raven banner. Later, Norse sources describe raven banners as powerful symbols of Viking warfare. Some legends even claim that the banner itself could predict victory. If the raven appeared to move, victory was coming. If it hung still, defeat was near. It's an incredible story, but we have to be careful. The supernatural details come from much later traditions. We cannot prove that Ubbe actually carried a magical banner, but the story survived because it represented something bigger. The Vikings had arrived in England as an apparently unstoppable force. Their banners had become symbols of fear. Their commanders had become legends. And yet, on this battlefield, one of those legendary commanders was dead. Ubbe's defeat mattered for another reason. At almost the same time, Alfred was preparing his own return. The king had been driven into hiding, but he had not surrendered. From Athelney, Alfred began gathering men. Messengers travelled across Wessex. Warriors returned to his banner. An army began to form. Alfred emerged from the marshes. He marched against Guthrum. At Edington, the two armies finally met. The Vikings formed their shield wall. The English formed theirs, and Alfred's army pushed forward. The battle ended with a decisive English victory. Guthrum was defeated. The Vikings were forced to negotiate. Guthrum eventually accepted baptism, and a treaty was established. Wessex had survived, and Alfred had stopped the Viking advance. Ubbe never lived to see it, but his death had removed one of the forces threatening the English kingdom at exactly the moment when Alfred was preparing his comeback. And this is what makes Ubbe's story so fascinating. Unlike Ivar, we don't have a huge historical record describing his every move. Unlike Bjorn, his name isn't attached to famous voyages across distant seas. And unlike Alfred, he never became a king remembered across the centuries. His story is fragmented, part history, part saga, part legend. But his place in the Viking invasion of England remains important, because the men remembered as Ragnar's sons belonged to a generation that transformed England forever. They didn't simply raid, they conquered, they captured cities, they defeated kings, and they began settling permanently on English land. The Great Heathen Army changed the political map of England. Viking settlements grew, Scandinavian influence spread, and the conflict between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons would continue for generations. Ubbe was one of the warriors caught at the center of that transformation. He came to England as a conqueror. He fought for Viking power, and he died fighting on English soil. But perhaps the most important part of his story is what happened after his death. The Vikings did not disappear. Their armies became settlements. Their settlements became communities. Their communities became kingdoms. And eventually, Viking rulers would sit on the English throne itself. More than a century after the Great Heathen Army arrived, another Viking ruler would rise to power. He would not come as a raider. He would not come simply to destroy England. He would come as a king. His name was Cnut, and his story would begin a completely different chapter in the history of the Vikings and England. Ubbe may have been forgotten by many, but the world he helped create would survive long after him. He came as a Viking. He died as a warrior, and his legacy remained in the England he helped change forever.